I'm Professor Michael Wolff, and this is Latin American Politics Online. Some of you might recall my little story about how, when I was just a wee kid, some 20 years ago, I tried to join a rebel insurgency deep in the jungles of southern Mexico, the Zapatistas, only to be told by the rebel leader, the guy called Subcomandante Marcos, that we'd all be better off if I went back to college instead. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I did feel a bit rejected by this. I mean, here I was offering to risk my life for the cause, and this masked man was telling me, nah, thanks, but we don't really need you. But then the subcomandante put his hand on my shoulder and he said, puedes ayudarnos mucho más desde allá, dando a conocer nuestro movimiento y usando tu intelecto para cambiar las opiniones de la gente. Así nos puedes ayudar, brother, no con armas, sino con la mente. And so it was. I came to realize over time that la lucha, the struggle of the Zapatistas, wasn't really about fighting and killing people. It wasn't about overthrowing the old regime either. Marcos and the Zapatistas carried weapons, but this wasn't about waging a hot war, so to speak. Part of it was self-defense, to be sure, but mostly it was about creating a spectacle, a symbolic gesture to catch the attention of both the Mexican nation and the world. And they were saying, hey, we're here, we're being threatened with destruction, and we're not going to stand for it. Ya basta.
La única condición en que nosotros entregaríamos las armas es muertos.
A lot of questions emerged out of that strange encounter in the jungle with the Zapatista leader. Like, who were they exactly? What were they fighting for? What were they fighting against? What was the starting point of all this? The inspiration? Was there an end point? And why were they fighting this weird, non-violent way, like while propagating this appearance of armed revolutionaries? Well, the EZLN, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, drew its name from Mexico's Revolutionary War hero, Emiliano Zapata, who led an army of peasants back in the 1910s and who fought for a radical redistribution of land in favor of the poor. Since then, however, wealth and land had again become concentrated in the hands of a few. And as Mexico began to embrace neoliberal economic policies in the wake of the 1982 debt crisis, this inequality and the rural poverty it aggravated had deepened further, especially in majority indigenous states like Chiapas in the south of Mexico. It was there that the Zapatistas began to organize in secret during the 1980s, anticipating a day when neoliberalism would end up threatening their very existence, both as small farmers and as a collection of indigenous cultural groups. As they understood it, that day came on January 1st, 1994, the day that NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, went into effect. And so early in the morning on that foggy New Year's Day, they descended from the mountains of Chiapas and took control of 5 cities throughout the state, proclaiming the rebellion in front of the whole world. But this was just a brief show of force. Less than 2 weeks later, they quietly melted back into the forest and jungles from whence they came and waited for the next step. But wait, why was NAFTA so significant? Well, you may recall from recent political bickering in the United States that NAFTA was a hard pill to swallow even here. For this free-ish trade agreement was bound to hurt American manufacturing industries and lead to substantial job loss. However, the stakes were much higher in Mexico, where upwards of half the population in 1994 worked in small-scale agriculture and would soon have to compete head-on with America's massive agro-industrial complex. In short, NAFTA, which was essentially neoliberalism institutionalized, this agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, threatened to destroy the livelihoods of tens of millions of Mexicans, including the vast majority of Mexico's indigenous peoples, whose cultural identities tended to be rooted in the cultivation of staple crops like corn and beans. And so it was. The Zapatistas were rebelling against the imposition of a neoliberal world order that threatened to annihilate and erase the livelihood and culture of millions of Mexicans. But why didn't they use their weapons to try to overthrow the state like so many other revolutionary movements did since the late 1950s? Like, say, Cuba in 1959 or Nicaragua 20 years later. I mean, wouldn't taking over the state be the best way to change the course of history? If you did that, the new revolutionary government could simply tear up the NAFTA deal altogether. Hell, it could forcefully redistribute land to the peasantry, just like Emiliano Zapata did back in the 1910s. Problem solved. The problem was that this was 1994, a few years after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And to be sure, revolutionary struggles were never easy in Latin America to begin with, even back when the Soviets and the Vietnamese and the Cubans were actively aiding Marxist revolutionaries throughout the world, sending them weapons, training their guerrilla leaders, and advocating for them on the international stage. Indeed, most revolutionary movements in Latin America collapsed under the weight of violent state repression even during the Cold War, thanks in good part because this repression was often supported by the good old Colossus of the North. Now, in 1994, with the communist countries gone or out of the picture, armed revolutionary movements found themselves in a pickle, so to speak. Some raced to secure UN-brokered peace agreements, like the FMLN in El Salvador in 1992, or the URNG in Guatemala in 1996. Others, like the FARC in Colombia, discovered that they didn't need the communist bloc. They had cocaine, which could keep them afloat indefinitely. Many others simply petered out, their fighters quietly emerging from the jungles to look for other opportunities. Simply put, 1994 was an awkward time for a new revolutionary army to jump onto the scene in Latin America. But the Zapatistas were not just any old revolutionary army. Indeed, El Subcomandante Marcos often said that they were not revolutionaries at all. What were they? They were just rebels, rebelling against the neoliberal world order. Not an army trying to violently overthrow the national state and forcefully carry out a revolution. And this was a good thing too, because had they attempted to violently overthrow the Mexican government for real, they almost certainly would have been annihilated, and very quickly. They were, after all, just a few thousand poorly armed peasants hiding in some jungles nearly 1,000 miles from the nation's capital. How are they going to overthrow the Mexican government? Now, in a brilliant turn of strategy, the Zapatistas instead launched a massive and massively effective public relations campaign, both in Mexico and beyond. They arranged, for example, to have friendly journalists from all around the world come witness their uprising in San Cristóbal de las Casas, the capital of Chiapas, and report what they were seeing. Then they were the first armed movement to create an actual website to promote their cause. And instead of fighting bloody battles in the name of some future socialist paradise, they portrayed themselves symbolically and in reality as just a humble bunch of progressive indigenous farmers simply fighting for their survival in a world taken over by a greedy global economic elite.
In exactly 5 days, we will be $100 billion richer.
Furthermore, they understood that the times had changed, especially up in the global north. They knew, for example, not to speak of things like the proletariat and the bourgeoisie and other such passé Cold War terms. Instead, they spoke of women's rights. They spoke of sustainable farming. They spoke of the preservation of indigenous cultures in Mexico and elsewhere. Now, these were issues and images that were sure to speak to the middle-class sensibilities of the middle 1990s in the global north. And well, the strategy worked wonderfully. By drawing the world's attention and affection, the Zapatistas made it virtually impossible for the Mexican government to react to the rebellion in their hair-trigger traditional way. That is, the government couldn't just come in and massacre everybody. They had to negotiate. And negotiate they did, legislating numerous reforms throughout the 1990s and early 2000s in order to provide state-guaranteed protections for indigenous people and for women, and last but not least, small-scale farmers whose livelihoods would be destroyed as a result of the NAFTA agreement. Of course, this kind of victory isn't so glorious as the revolutionary overthrow of a state. And to be sure, the various political reforms enacted as a result of the Zapatista rebellion have served more as mere speed bumps on the path of this new neoliberal world order, instead of a blockage to it. However, by embracing a global public relations strategy in place of armed violence, and by tailoring their identity and messaging to the social mores of the present Cold War world, the Zapatistas achieved an extremely rare feat in the history of revolutionary mobilization. They survived to tell their story. I'm Professor Michael Wolff, and this is Latin American Politics Online.
Soy el fuego que arde tu piel, soy el agua que mata tu sed, el castillo, la torre, yo soy la espada que guarda el caudal, tú el aire que respiro yo, y la luz de la luna en el mar, la garganta que ansió